We will begin this evening with two fascinating dissertations. Our first speaker is Jenny DeDecker, PhD, LMT, CLC. She can explain her credentials, but she completed her doctorate in mind-body medicine with a specialization in mindful leadership in healthcare in 2023. Her research focused on the embodiment of compassion in healthcare and the potential for compassion to mitigate burnout. She recently completed her tenure as the inaugural Department of Research postdoctoral teaching and research fellow and is now teaching grounded theory in the Department of Research at Saybrook. She's awaiting the review of a recently submitted grant for continued research. Her ongoing research includes 3 qualitative studies with Dr. Walker Ladd and Department of Research faculty, and I see that Walker is with us. Welcome, Dr. Ladd. Jenny is a strong advocate for health and wellness and is a published researcher in perinatal mood and anxiety disorders as well as compassionate care. She's the owner of Full Moon Rising, a wellness studio. She resides in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan with her husband and 2 children. Welcome, Dr. DeDecker, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moss. I really appreciate being here, and thank you so much for everybody who came tonight. It's really a joy to be able to sit here with you and talk about something that's deeply passionate to me, and hopefully I can inspire a little passion for this topic in you as well. Yeah, I'll quickly run through those initials, Dr. Moss. Thank you for that. So LMT is, I'm a licensed massage therapist, and I'm certified lactation counselor as well. So tonight I'll be discussing my doctoral research on compassion. Brief overview of our agenda for tonight. We will be looking at my research question, discussing the literature review in brief, walk you through my research methods with data collection and analysis, talk you through the theory generation and what unfolded through my research. And we'll have time for question and answers at the end. So before I get too deep into my presentation, I wanted to just speak briefly about something that surprised me when I was putting this together. And that was the emotional influx that happened while I was building this presentation. And the only thing I can really compare it to is when you're in the middle of a gigantic transformative life experience, you don't always recognize what's happening. And looking back on this, a year and a half later, all of those emotions started coming back up. And of all of them, the greatest and most overwhelming was gratitude. Gratitude for my participants who shared their stories, gratitude for my family for what they put up with while I went through this process, deep undying gratitude for my committee. Celine is here on the call, Dr. Vega Walker, Dr. Ladd, and Dr. Cliff Smythe. They all saw me well before I saw myself. I never could have done it without them. And then you all, deep gratitude for those of you who came out tonight to be part of this and part of the continued journey of my research. So thank you. But all of the research that I did, this was my most favorite quote to recognize and establish what compassion is. Compassion is so multi-layered and so multi-textured that it's hard to give it just one standalone definition. However, what encompasses it most, in my opinion, is this final statement that compassion is the capacity to open to the reality of suffering and aspire to its healing. I wanted to lay that framework just a little bit before we get started, that compassion has this component of recognition that suffering is there. However, following that up with this desire and aspire towards the relief of that suffering. My guiding research question was how do healthcare providers foster their experience of compassion? How do they do it? This is what I was so curious about. In the literature that we'll talk about here shortly, we know the actions that they take that are recognized as compassionate. We know how the patients receive that. We know how the healthcare institution and establishment desires that, what they ask for, but I couldn't really find in the literature how do they do it? How do people foster, embody, engage, manifest? How are they doing it? And it was through many, many conversations with Dr. Ladd and with Dr. Vega that I came to the understanding that I was really looking at a grounded theory question, really looking to find something that was a little bit novel and different. This generation of compassion as far as healthcare providers go was what really fueled my process. So just a brief summary of the literature. You may not all find it as exciting as I did, but I wanted to pull out the parts that seemed most remarkable and most magnificent as far as the impact goes on my research. These were the main components, kind of the headers of my literature review, everything from the working definitions to what is happening in healthcare now, what are the models and the interventions, and then comparing that to the theories and the relevance beyond. Real quick, the definitions are always so important, I feel, anytime that you're discussing a concept that can be viewed in multiple perspectives. So I want to briefly touch on the definitions of compassion, burnout, compassion fatigue, and empathic distress. We're all incredibly familiar with the term burnout, unfortunately, more familiar now in the last 4 years than we ever were prior. And burnout is simply when the demands outweigh one's perceived capacity. And compassion fatigue is a sister of that really typically refers to caring professions. So healthcare, teachers, that sort of profession where compassion is reduced due to absorbing the suffering of others. I will argue this term just slightly here tonight in my presentation, that really what we're looking at is something that's more akin to empathic distress, where that exposure to suffering triggers the adverse response. And the reason that I will dive into that a little bit is because of the development of compassion science and the neuroscientific developments that we now know, thanks to the fMRI. So this development of compassion science is when I would say my eyes were brought wide open. When I first got into the literature and looked at what we were discovering from a neuroscientific standpoint and how that was impacting compassion as a science. I actually discovered there was the Oxford Handbook for Compassion Science, and I finally felt like I had found my bedside book. But compassion science really has grown in the last decade. The roots of compassion science, interestingly enough, are in contemplative neuroscience. They did start with a little bit of a background in the Buddhist tradition and the mindfulness tradition of when that compassion really came to the forefront of our scientists here in the United States. And when that started to come about, along with the development of the fMRI, we really started to recognize that something else is going on here. There's something else from a neuroscience standpoint, from a social science standpoint, even from a neuropsychological standpoint. Something else is happening when it comes to compassion. And what is that? And that's when I really got interested and got excited about this research. So the neuroscientific advances that we found is where I am drawing these lines between the difference between compassion fatigue, maybe even as a misnomer, but instead looking at empathic distress. And the reason for this is that once we started learning about what's actually happening in the brain, we recognized that there were several systems that were coming online when it came to the compassionate experience. So the compassion research really leaned into these advances to better understand the physiological, the social, the psychological experience of compassion, as well as its implications on the contemplative practices, compassion actions themselves, and altruistic behaviors. So we do know that compassion is a stepwise process. It's not isolated. So it's not isolated in time and space. It's not isolated within the brain either. The first level of the brain that kind of turns on when one's experiencing a compassionate moment or compassionate exchange is this idea of visceral empathy. Unfortunately, our human brain cannot really differentiate between my pain and your pain. So when I see your pain and I go into an empathic experience, my brain starts to tell my body that that's actually mine. It's minor compared to what the person that I'm with is experiencing, but that neurological kickback is happening. Because of that, we start to see this recognition of empathic distress, where if we stay kind of locked into that visceral empathy, slowly our own body starts to break down, our own systems start to break down, burnout really comes into play, and we start to have this this kind of downward spiral that leads to depersonalization, depression, and even suicide. However, what we discovered within the research of compassion was that there was a second neurological system that kicks in, which kind of shifts us out of the visceral empathy and actually into a more somatic oriented mental activation of recognition with other. So a perspective taking happens. So now that I'm feeling that empathy, I'm feeling your suffering, I also have the perspective that, oh, this is not mine, this is yours. And I recognize that because of this place of non-judgment that comes in to the compassionate experience, where I can see that that's yours, I can see that's not mine, and I can decide where I'm going to put my judgment in that. And interestingly, and kind of my favorite part, is this kicks actually into the reward system, and it sets us online for love and affection, because in that space of perspective taking is where, when we go back to that original definition and we think about that willingness, that desire to do something, that shifts us out of the empathic response that we're receiving and into that altruistic or other oriented expression. And when we give, and we know this from the altruism research as well, that when we give, we get a neurologic kickback of reward. This is affectionately referred to as the warm glow of compassion in the literature, where we actually start to feel that sense of joy within the suffering. So it's really sets us apart from empathy, which is kind of where I got really interested. I was, okay, if there's something else going on, how are people managing this in real time? Situating this in healthcare itself, in the field of healthcare, and what we really know is that there are common components in the literature. It's process-based. So as I mentioned before, it's not a standalone process in our mind, in our brain, and it's not standalone in relation. Okay? It's an other-oriented, it's a relationship, and it's not isolated. It's not an isolated state of being. We also know that the nature of compassion begins with this attentiveness. So we have that emotional connection. We have this idea of being present, communicating, building an understanding, and taking action to provide that care. So these are those actions that I had mentioned earlier that we're really familiar with in the literature. We know that these are the actions. We know that these are, the way that the patient is receiving these actions is what they consider to be compassionate care. When the care provider communicates, builds that relationship. And again, my question, how are they doing it, continued to come up for me. From a healthcare culture and a systems perspective, we can look at this organization of compassion from a humanistic and person-centered healthcare industry along the bottom. That's what's going to hold this up. There's a framework of the compassionate establishment consisting of 3 components. We have the presence of the healing environment, a sense of connection among people, and the sense of meaning and purpose that we'll talk about again towards the end. And what we're recognizing and what's been suggested is that if we have this shift from this top-down approach where the entire organization recognizes these 3 components, these 3 factors as being important, we can start to build an institutional awareness of the necessity of compassion, allowing providers to actually experience their ability to be compassionate through the research that I kind of discovered through my dissertation. So we know that from a systems perspective, we know the possibilities. Again, what's actually happening? How is this happening? So taking a moment, coming back into my research question, right, looking at the experiences of these providers brought me into my research method of Straussian grounded theory. So Straussian grounded theory is a qualitative methodology. It's designed to construct a theory that's grounded in the data. So as a novice researcher, the holistic nature of qualitative work was really interesting to me, and I was really looking to discover that meaning and purpose. And Corbin and Strauss, who are the founders of Straussian grounded theory, wrote of qualitative researchers as individuals who are curious about the world around them and determined to work for social justice and the betterment of the human condition. Reading that quote, this is it. This is where I align. This is where I want to be. How does this come about? And with Straussian grounded theory, it appreciates the complexity of the human experience. So it appreciates these social worlds and where we live, suggesting that it's an appropriate methodology for understanding and interpreting human conduct. So this supported the goal of my study. Really looking at what's happening within this human contact, human content, and how we're experiencing these social worlds and these social norms. I will not shy away from being totally honest that there were many times I felt like I was in over my head. But I had amazing mentors. Thank you, Dr. Walker-Ladd, for supporting me in that and being able to hold my process. Being a grounded theory researcher really requires an ability to be in the unknown, rest in the ambiguity, which as a novice researcher wasn't totally easy for me, but as I said, I had some support and was able to hang out in that space as it unfolded. Briefly on Straussian grounded theory, just to kind of place this in the world of research, grounded theory has its philosophical underpinnings in pragmatism, this belief that there are multiple truths and there's a subjective experience. So you can already start to see why this was so attractive to me. Working in the field of compassion science, we know it's a multi-layered process. We know that it's very qualitative, very subjective, and pragmatism was a perfect blend for what I was doing with my research. Really recognizes this dynamic nature that's fluid in regards to truth. William James is, I don't know how many walks I went on listening to William James podcasts during this experience, really just trying to listen to his words and understand pragmatism. And he argued that the reality is conceived of three influencers: the fluctuation of our sensations, the meaning we make of our sensations, and our relationship to previous experiences and understandings of our own truth. So again, really finding the alignment here was so pivotal for me to be able to move forward through this research. So this different worldview really focused on connecting the belief with the action. So that's really speaking to pragmatism. Symbolic interactionism is the other philosophical underpinning that really sets Straussian grounded theory apart. It, really recognizing that meaning is constantly changing. Meaning is based on the perspective that's assigned to it, and again, remains fluid, ever changing. Okay, so the potential for this meaning links symbolic interactionism to the pragmatic philosophy of multiple truths and the discovery that these truths are coming through the human perspective. So how did I do it? What did this look like? For any novice researchers on the call, you're probably thinking the same thoughts that I was of, okay, what does all of this mean? What is my tangible takeaway here when I'm looking at a study design? So my population, I wanted to look at healthcare providers from diverse modalities. I didn't want to specifically look at MDs or specifically look at nurses. So I opened my aperture up pretty wide. I feel really excited about my return on that. I had 44% of my providers were allopathic medicine providers, 33% were integrative healthcare providers, and 22% were mental health care providers. So I had a really great scope. I was really lucky when it comes to recruitment to be able to get such a wide scope of individuals. I did end up with 27 participants, which for those of you who are a little bit new to qualitative work, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of data. Again, just feeling so blessed that so many people were willing. And what that really spoke to me was just seeing a flyer with the words compassion and healthcare on it, and do you want to come do this, got that many people out to have this conversation with me, to spend an hour to an hour and a half with me. Really showed me the worth of this project and was so inspiring along the way. My sample strategies were through theoretical and snowball sampling. So a brief understanding of that is, as I had a very particular group of people I was looking to have in my study, right? I was looking for healthcare providers, and snowball sampling is this, kind of word of mouth and being able to, I get a handful and then they tell people and I get a couple more handfuls and so on. So both of those sample strategies worked quite well for me. I recruited just on social media and word of mouth. Again, the massive amount of return on that simply through recruiting in those ways. And I will tell you, as continuing in my life as a researcher, recruitment is not always that easy. And so that, really, I started my journey in research recruitment from a very special place. And I recognize that now. Also looking at screening. So I did have inclusion and exclusion criteria. I really wanted participants who had been in their field for at least 5 years, trying to limit for, the ideas of early providers typically have less burnout. And so I wanted to make sure that I was looking at people who'd been in it long enough, who could give me a good view of how this is looking for them. And then I was looking at adults who were between the age of 18 and 30 and 18 and 65. Consent happened through IRB. So part of our research project, making a dissertation go, is getting on the good side of IRB and making sure that informed consent in your IRB comes through. So looking at data collection, it was all through interviews. Semi-structured interviews is kind of the gold standard when it comes to qualitative work, and especially within Straussian grounded theory. I had a flexible interview guide, meaning that I could really let the conversation go where it needed to go. Coming into grounded theory, although I did do a literature review, I come into it trying to limit my a priori, trying to limit my bias. And so coming up with a really stringent interview guide isn't necessarily the best way to approach that. So having something a little bit more fluid so that I was able to kind of follow the data, follow where it took me. The idea of constant comparison is specific to grounded theory. It's where we get the opportunity to analyze data as it's coming in with data that was previous. So we get to look at that subsequent similarities and differences as they're happening. And the transcripts were all de-identified. I ended up with 379 pages of data. Novice researcher feeling over her head. Coding came through. This is open coding, axial coding, and selective coding. This is, again, specific to Straussian grounded theory. I have a lot of memoing, taking notes, jotting stuff down, being able to work with my data in real time, having codes emerge, and then selective coding is when we compare codes against codes, and that's when the theory generation really starts to come forward. I love these things. I hope that you do too. This is a data flow schematic. It walks you through what happened for me. Again, the 27 participants, almost 400 pages of data. Moving through that initial layer of coding, ended up with almost 900 initial significant units of meaning. So 900 little pieces of paper floating around that brought me into my coding. Through axial coding, I had 10 emerging categories, 196 open coding categories that broke down into 10 emerging categories. Continuing to work with the data through the Straussian methods landed me on 4 core categories, which I will talk about here in generation of my theory. So the 4 categories that came through for me, I really look at engaging with the system and engaging with purpose as the bookends. So the 2 in the middle are what I call the juice. This is the how. They engage with self and they engage with heart, but those are impossible to take out without the bookends. So the theory had to include the content of engaging with the system as well as engaging with the purpose. So, this is the how of the theory really lies in the center, but requires that feedback loop, which we'll talk about here. So engaging with heart, kind of what does this mean? What are we looking at here? Engaging with heart is how the providers are doing those things, right? This is the listening, the communicating. This is our human connection, that idea of empathy, trust, and being present. So this is the how that they're actually engaging in that therapeutic context. So engaging with their patients and with their clients. From there, the engaging with self. So again, we can really kind of look at, okay, now how, right? I kept digging. How are they doing this? And self-care continued to come up to the surface. It wasn't even a question in my interview guide. It came forward so front and center that without their ability to recognize their need for self-care, this would not be possible. Self-care included everything from having boundaries, knowing how to say no, to stepping away and having something to drink, something to eat, right? As simple as feeling fed and watered. So many of my participants recognize their need to just be watered during a shift. Okay, these are not gigantic asks, and this is what my participants were able to find to keep themselves going forward. Again, one of the bookends, engaging with the system, right? So they live, they work, they experience compassion within the system. And this is an unforgiving system. We know the dysfunction of the healthcare system. We know that burnout is front and center. However, this is the same system that also provided them a container for hope. They all mentioned this idea of hope within the system. It can be different. It can change. There can be progress. And it was in that hope that they really were able to find their ability to move into this idea of engaging with purpose. being in that connected space with their patients, knowing that the system is what provided them their patients and gave them the opportunity to connect. So even though they're sitting in the middle of dysfunction, they recognized it as the ability to find their compassionate heart. It was who they are, and it was why they do what they do. In, you know, kind of in a synopsis here, the engaged compassion model looks at how healthcare providers foster their compassion through an approach that is cyclic and interwoven. It includes mindsets, actions, interactions. They work within that unforgiving system with challenges and barriers, but it's their awareness, above all, their awareness that allows them to recognize their need and be willing to meet their need. So this is what I found so novel, that these providers recognize that they have a need, but instead of putting the need away, they found ways to meet it so that they could fortify their capacity. This is how they did it. They fortified their bodies, their minds, and their spirits to forge meaningful connections with their patients. That brought them this sense of fulfillment and joy. It bolstered them and reminded them of why they do what they do. Looking briefly at, you know, what we do with a dissertation, what we do with any publication, we make sure that we bring forward limitations and implications and recognition of future research. My limitations that I brought forward were participatory bias. They're already recognizing that compassion is important by answering the flyer. And this was not really something that I could control for. I couldn't really pull that out. So I recognized it, recognized that I am receiving participants who know it's important. Maybe intrinsically that means that it's something that they do. This would be a place for further research of interviewing, you know, people who don't actually relate to compassion, and maybe they call it something else. I had geographic and cultural limitations. It was all United States, although I did have all the way across the United States. And then we cannot leave out the pandemic influence. So I did my research in the summer of 22. And all of my interviews, for the most part, were done via Zoom. So we were really coming into that place after the pandemic where people were starting to come up for breath and recognizing the trauma that they had been through. Looking at implications, this need to dive deeper into self-care and self-awareness. We need to pursue further pragmatic approaches to healthcare research. We need to look at inter, and transpersonal applications. We need to educate about the importance of self-care. This isn't just, it's not just a pastime or a hobby. This is something that needs to be coming forward. The idea of looking at self-care ethics has become really interesting to me. You know, thinking about if this is such a cornerstone of compassion, if this is such a cornerstone of what our providers are capable of doing, do we need to look at it in regards to ethics? Addressing moral injury and bringing self-care into the entire healthcare industry. So again, I want to thank you all so much for being here. It's been such my joy to be here and be able to share with you. I think that we'll have some time for question and answers. I also do have a couple of slides of references if anybody's interested. I'm more than happy to be able to send those out and hand those over.